things, but it also, I think, allows us to have an overview of a very beautiful and rich system of thought. And hopefully we can all allow ourselves into that, even if we do not share the fundamental commitments that Bonaventure has. Becoming mindful of God in all things, to enjoy God's goodness, the sweetness of union with God in contemplative ecstasy or peace. This is what Bonaventure sets as the goal of this particular work, and it is the goal of his life. All light, that is all intelligibility, is meant to lead us on to peace, pax, the great good that his father in faith, St. Francis, put before his children. Bonaventure was born in 1217 in Papal lands on a hilltop town northwest of Rome, now known as Civita di Bagnoregio, which has a handful of inhabitants now, and it's geologically unstable, unfortunately. So what was Bonaventure's house has long since fallen off the hilltop. He fell mortally ill as a child, and his mother invoked the intercession of St. Francis probably not long after Francis's passing in 1226. So from then, Bonaventure was always a son of Francis. He joined the Franciscan order in 1243, and from that time on, he studied at the University of Paris. The two mendicant orders, that is the two begging orders that had arisen at the beginning of the 1200s, the one that St. Thomas Aquinas belonged to, the Dominicans, was founded by St. Dominic, to, in particular, to fight the Cathars in southern France. And we've seen that that's an interesting history because of its relationship, that area's relationship to troubadours and chivalric love. And the early 1200s also, this immense figure, St. Francis, impacted the world, and he was seen as an apocalyptic figure. Things seemed to change with him, not least because in the end he received the wounds of Christ in his own body, the stigmata, and this made him for many Christians an alter Christus, another Christ. The mendicant orders established study centers and religious houses in Paris because the University of Paris was the great intellectual center of the time. France was at the time becoming much more unified as a nation after its long feudal fragmentation. Philip II Augustus was able to wrest the French lands that were under English control that had been under English control for several decades. And so there was this great national integration going on at the time that the mendicant orders were establishing study houses in Paris. The Franciscans established the Couvent des Cordeliers, the Franciscan convent, and the university community would end up hearing sermons. They're gathering there and hearing sermons on feast days. While on Sundays, they would go to the Dominican monastery, the Couvent des Jacobins de la Rue Saint-Jacques, on Sundays. So there, Bonaventure would have heard Albert the Great preaching, for instance, and that is important to know how integrated the intellectual life of the university world in Paris was. Bonaventure studied under Alexander of Hales, who was a regular, he was a secular master, meaning he was a cleric who did not belong to an order. He became a regular, that is, he took on the rule of St. Francis and moved his chair to the School of the Minors. The Friars Minors are another name for the Franciscans. Eventually, the University of Paris would allocate 4 of the 12 magistral chairs of theology to the mendicants, 2 for the Franciscans, 2 for the Dominicans. In fact, St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure were named to their chairs officially as doctors in the same year. though that was after a long struggle, because there was a great amount of tension between the seculars, that is, the priests, the clergy that did not did not belong to a religious order, and then the religious, the ones who belonged to orders. And the mendicants and the seculars were engaged in a long controversy over what was the way to live. We've seen a little hint of this. Jean de Meun seemed to belong to the anti-mendicant wing in Paris. But the popes had a special interest in seeing the mendicant orders thrive, and they had a special interest in seeing that the University of Paris have a special relationship with the papacy as opposed to, say, the King of France. And so the Pope insisted that the mendicants receive the kind of recognition that their learning had earned them. The mendicant orders were revolutionary because in a time when the cities were becoming much more prosperous, much more populated and vital, and commercialism was on the rise, there was a fear in what we call Christendom now that worldliness was overtaking the people. And so wandering lay preachers arose, especially in the 1100s, and St. Francis was one of these wandering lay preachers. And even though he would call the people in the cities in particular to a life that they were not living, that is, a life above all, where you gave up the need to plan for tomorrow. That was the radical Franciscan charism, was to live only by the graciousness of God, to be holy fools, as it were. And that was obviously the very opposite of worldliness. And a lot of people, whether they wanted to follow Francis or not, recognized that this was the New Testament message, that one should somehow find oneself in a position where one is not playing the world's game anymore. Take no thought for tomorrow, don't plan. This would lead to problems, though, in an order that would eventually attract thousands of followers. So how do you, if you have an order that strictly says you can't possess property, how do you clothe, house, and feed thousands of Franciscans? And so in the end, when Bonaventure was called to be Minister General of the Franciscan order, he had to deal with this question of how to preserve the radical spirit of St. Francis in an ongoing institutional arrangement. And the wing that he had to contend with, we call the spirituals, or they call themselves the spirituals, as opposed to the conventuals. This was a disagreement as to how the Franciscans could stand with regard to property. Could you, in fact, own as a community or in some way property like the housing that you had? John of Parma belonged to this spiritual wing of the Franciscans that wanted to be radically followers of St. Francis, don't plan. This wing was affected by the 12th century monk Joachim of Fiore, who had this apocalyptic vision that the ages of the world were turning, that you had the age of the Father in the Old Testament, you had the age of the Son in the New, and then you have the age of the Holy Spirit, which will move the power away from the secular clergy and the hierarchy to the religious, to the monks. And so the spirituals were trying to advance this vision. Bonaventure was not on that side. He was in the end, even though he was a man as driven by speculative eros as St. Thomas Aquinas, he was a man in the end called to be the Minister General of the Franciscans. He had to be a man of practical matters from 1257 until his close to his death in 1274. So he had to think through how it is that one could be a Franciscan true to the spirit of poverty and yet still manage an organization that had to prepare in some way for the next day. And so he, in the end, repudiated the spirituals, and he was reviled by that wing ever after, though even his greatest critics always recognized his personal sanctity. So everybody agreed that this was a man of holiness. So what we see in the end is that Bonaventure was an intellectual. That's what he cared about. He cared about finding through the path of wisdom this ecstatic union with God. And so he goes at the once he's elected minister general, a couple of years later, he goes to on a pilgrimage to Mount Alvernia, which I believe is east of Florence. And there, St. Francis had received his vision a couple of years before his death of the crucified Christ in the form of an angel, a seraph, a six-winged angel. And Bonaventure wanted to have this interior experience of what Francis experienced on the mountain. And as he was there, as he recounts the beginning of the itinerarium, the journey of the mind into God, he recounts how he saw that vision of the six-winged angel could be a blueprint for every person's rise to contemplative ecstasy. And that's what he lays out for us in this gem of a book. I know it's very, very complex because it's so compact, but it is a book that allows us to see the whole scope of the world in light of the ground of being, as it were. And if one can, even if one doesn't have shared the Christian faith here, one can say, philosophically, what are we talking about here? The yearning soul towards the ground of being, what's necessary to get from here to there? And is there something that can be gleaned from this very fervent presentation of that ladder of ascent? You will notice, and I would like to discuss tonight, how there are real differences between and Bonaventure. They're the two great representatives of high scholasticism, but they represent in some ways the great options for those who are faithful Catholics. On the one hand, there are the believers at the time that St. Augustine is the norm, and that Augustinian piety is the way to maintain true faith. And St. Bonaventure belonged to that tradition. He belonged to an Augustinian tradition that was inflected by the school of St. Victor, by St. Anselm, by Dionysius, above all, the pseudo-Areopagite. So it was a very, very Neoplatonized kind of Augustinianism. But above all, it was a very earnest, semi-monastic scholasticism. Whereas, and so in the readings that we've had in the semester, I would think Bonaventure is very much like Al-Ghazali in temperament. Whereas St. Thomas wanted to accept as much as could be accepted from the new science, as it were, of Aristotle, as those works were being translated from the Arabic world. And the real debate in Paris at the time, the University of Paris, was not only between the mendicants and the non-mendicants, but also between the radical Aristotelians, especially in the Faculty of Arts. So you had to study in the Faculty of Arts, become a Master of Arts. That's where we still have the term MA for our degree system. You had to become a Master of Arts before you could go to the higher faculties, which were law, medicine, and theology. But the greatest science was theology. And so you had to be a Master of Arts before you could go on to the Faculty of Theology, study there, and become a Master of Theology. The Masters of Arts, the Faculty of Arts, they tended, as the century went on, to become very radical Aristotelians, and they were mostly in the Averroistic kind of scheme. They believed that natural reason had rights that theology simply could not impinge upon. Aquinas tried to mediate that with the Augustinian piety, and Bonaventure was on the other side of Augustinian piety, trying to truly humble the pretenses of reason, where it would say, for instance, is the world eternal or not? Aristotle had maintained that the world was eternal, and Aquinas argued that that was a logical position, even though it was false. And Bonaventure argued instead that this didn't even make rational sense. So that was the intellectual world of Paris, and above all, the eros, the passion for for union with God is what kept Bonaventure studying and teaching and so on fire to try to share with all of us how it is we might become more like his father, his spiritual father, Francis. And I'm going to leave it at that.